Hi everyone, my name is Venice Urbanis. Together with Nomeda Urbanis, we are curators of the Swamp Pavilion and the Swamp School. And we are co-conveners of the third chapter of the Swamp School that is titled Communism. So we're grappling with this term of the communism with the help of our interlocutors. Pascal Guéry and Nico Dox, and some of you attended the book launch yesterday that has the same title. That sort of like has the starting point in sociability between the human species. For us, as for artists and curators, and given our recent interest of the 5 years trying to sort of like unearth and recombine the term Anthropocene, given that we were working with the Zoetics project, it was very important to sort of like see that sociability in the expanded field, right? And the term eco-communism that today will be discussed by Maria Puig de la Bellocas and Dimitris Papadopoulos, we think represents that sort of like other kind of like point, of the reflection of the communism. In our proposition, the communism also has this sort of like term that we put in brackets, which is cohabitation, right? So originally, when we were thinking, starting in the last fall, how could we sort of like discuss these different facets of the what we call swamp, as the metonymy, as a metaphor, also as a model, as a philosophical proposition, also as a proposition of what we call intelligence. We were thinking of practice which we are familiar with Tinna Grétarsdóttir and Sigurjón Baldur Hafsteinsson represent, together with their expanded network of their collaborators, and of course I want to welcome Hildigunnur Sverrisdóttir and also Lárusson. And I may not know everybody who you guys brought, because this is one of the features of the Swamp School, that it starts sort of like growing and branching and expanding its networks. So I'm sure that you will introduce your collaborators, but I just wanted to say welcome everybody to the afternoon session where we're going to discuss hopefully we're going to discuss this expanded notion of sociability that involves not only human species, especially as we see these wonderful pets who arrived from Iceland, right? Thanks to our wonderful collaborator DHL, right? I understand that we've been in very friendly terms developing connections with them. Right? Yeah. Wonderful. Which again would be impossible, perhaps, sending the soil to the United States unless you are a Koch family member, right? Okay, which again we know from the history, as they were extracting some Soviet peat and bringing it to the United States in the 60s. I just perhaps should mention that with Tinna and Sigurjón, we have, should we say, longer-term relationship, even those kind of like the time aspect, especially in the context of the swamp, becomes very sort of like relative, right? Because in the swamp, 1 millimeter, it takes like 1 year to grow, right? So 7 years that we know each other, it just perhaps should equal 7 millimeters of the swamp time. We met in 2011 during the Reykjavik Arts Festival when the class from MIT came for research to Iceland, and Tinna at that time was our interlocutor, helping to understand all these complex relationships between military-industrial complex, Icelandic history as being positioned not only between the two tectonic plates but also between the two superpowers and ideologies represented by the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And it continued also further into the Future Fiction Summit, which we co-produced for this collaboration in 2016. But this is not commemoration of the family relationships of this 7 millimeters, right? But it is rather the time that should be given to you guys. And I ask everyone kindly please help with join me in welcoming Tinna and Sigurjón and Hildigunnur and Hannes and all the collaborators.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming this evening. What we are going to do here for the next 2.5, 3 hours is to introduce to you a project that we have been working on for quite some time. And the organization of the session is that Tinna and I will give you a kind of an introduction to the project. And then we will have 2 more talks after that by Hjörtur and then Pauline. And then we will take a short break, and in the break you will have the option of tasting some flavors out of the swamp in Iceland. But we brought some herbs with us, and it's now boiling in the pot, and it actually tastes very good. Cheers. And then after the short break we will have 2 more talks, and then we will break into a dirty mode of trying to cut this turf that we brought along with us, along with a gift-giving ceremony that involves those brown boxes that you can see here on the table. And you can also take a look at some of the petri dishes that we brought along with us with some of the inhabitants in a turf house in southern part of Iceland. So what we would like to do here today is, like I said, is to introduce you to the project that we call Turfiction, that we are currently working along with the architect Hildigunnur Sverrisdóttir, who is here, and the artist Hannes Lárusson, who is sitting here in the front. And we also collaborate with the botanist and director of the Botanic Garden, who is here, Hjörtur. He is over here, Hjörtur Þorbjörnsson, and then the microbiologist Pauline Bergsten, who is here, and her collaborator Stephen Knobloch, who couldn't be here, but hopefully you will meet him someday. He's not only a microbiologist but also a poet. And then the literary scholar Bjartdís Tómasdóttir, who is here as well. But those 4 that I mentioned, they are all graduate students at the University of Iceland. So the aim of the project, Turfiction, is to explore how turf house architecture can help us to think through questions about the possibility of life in capitalist ruins, to use the words of the anthropologist Anna Tsing. While communities and the environment fall deeper into precarious settings, we ask questions about how to face our circumstances, how to act in the present, and how to imagine the future. Turning to the turf house, the home of Icelanders for more than a millennium, as a tool to think through these questions might seem curious, as the Icelandic turf house has in fact taken the place of ruins in the Icelandic landscape. The architecture is extinct and only few houses remain. However, as Tom van Doren, an anthropologist and the author of the book Flightways, Life and Loss at the Edge of Extinction, like the book teaches us so elegantly, telling stories of extinctions aids us not just in comprehending what the loss of a different way of life means, but also urges us to think about our ability to respond and to care for new connections and relations. To quote Van Doren again and again, we need to ask, What does it mean to bring an abrupt ending to this particular way of life? What does this loss mean inside its specific multi-species communities? End of quote. While Van Doren tells stories of endangered birds, our subject is architecture, which we approach as a living organism, a creature, a living multi-species assemblage on the verge of extinction. Just like the swamp, in Iceland, the turf house was considered an obstacle to modern progress and affiliated with shame, foulness, diseases, and consequently brutally eradicated. In Iceland, the draining of the swamp and elimination of the turf house was already in full swing by the early 1940s, when the island introduced heavy machinery like bulldozers and excavators. The draining of swamps was in large part driven by an agricultural need, but also by subsidy. The fact is that only less than half of the land that has been drained is used by agriculture. Around 50% of the inland wetlands were drained. Emissions of CO2 from the drained wetlands alone counts for 68% of Iceland's total CO2 emissions. In the south, where our research project is located, 90–70% of wetlands have been impacted by the drainage project. While the importance of the swamp has been recognized in relation to carbon storage, biodiversity, water regulation, bird life, etc., the turf house, with its non-human and human fragility, sensitivity, intellect, and aesthetics, is unnoted. As such, the turf house is dead as a dodo. While we advocate for renewed interest in it, we are not necessarily on a mission to bring the turf house back on the ground. Instead, we suggest that there is an urgent need. Need to comprehend the loss of the turf house in order to redo practices, connections, and relations that are necessary in our quest of finding ways to live better in the future. Specifically, in thinking about how architecture can facilitate human and non-human connections and relations. Consequently, we ask broadly, in what way can the turf house direct us in becoming involved and knowledgeable about non-human others? In grappling with this question, Turfiction evokes the turf house as a speculative terrain, if not fictional. Instead of simply perceiving Icelandic turf house architecture as extinct cultural edifices, and therefore purely in anthropocentric terms, we approach the turf house not as an extension of humans, but rather an extension of the swamp. Turfiction opens a passageway through the corridors and chambers of the swamp, and contends that a need has emerged for humans to pass through it in order to redirect and redefine human perceptions and experiential knowledge production for the future. It is an attempt to explore socio-material entanglements, multi-species relations, time and space, as essential elements of the importance of creating architectural complexes of a dependent and growing coexistence. In building new narratives and making room for non-human others, relationality and creative involvement, the turf house invites us to imagine alternative and more swamp-bound temporalities, suggesting a rejection of today's bottomless instantaneity, to quote Pascal Guillain, who was here 1 or 2 days ago. At this moment, we are working on an exploded view of human and non-human scales of the turf house. The turf house consisting of complicated root systems, soil, fungi, mycelium, microbial colonies, water, plants, lichens, stones, wood, amniotic sacs, insects, mice, cows, sheep, and humans, to name just a few, is a complex multi-species assemblage. It not only depends on microorganisms as the key builders of turf and rhizomatic root growth. Its architectonic space is formed by multi-species interdependence, for example by heating purposes. For instance, the baðstofa, which is an Icelandic term, the communal space where people were born, lived and worked was at times built above the space that housed cows and sheep, cats and dogs, mice and lice, which generated heat for humans and other non-humans. As such, the turf house is evoked within the framework of Donna Haraway's concept of symbiosis, or making with. An ecosystem of humans and non-humans, the turf house adjusts our attention to more than human growth, life histories, scales, times and agencies. Such insights and alternative entanglements enhance human sensorial apertures and enriches sensory perception with sensibilities characteristic of the non-human sphere that have, to quote Beyakasa, implications for how we live together and how we belong in communities. The turf house is a composition of vibrant matters and coming together of different timescales and abilities. As such, it is a time device for amplifying human senses to alternative timescales of others who live with us, before us, and will outlive us. The evolutionary time of the multi-species turf house reminds us of our recent place in the archaic whole, and as such has the ability to accommodate the spasmodic eruptions of multiple timescales into a condensed present. In perpetual motion triggered by human and non-human agencies, the turf house is always unfinished, co-produced and cohabited. The turf house requires constant involvement and work and continuous care. It consists of distributed agencies and ruptures. New species immigrate and others disappear. Matter such as stones erode, organisms and plants decompose, soil forms and dynamic hyperobjects like water agitate its structure. The turf house expresses and is constantly transversed between powers of striating and smoothing. It is simultaneously a subject of scales and anarchist nature of matter, as Hildigunnur Sverrisdóttir will discuss in a bit. The turf house has amorphous form. It does not have clear boundaries, spatially or temporally. When a swamp is harvested, it is shaped into different forms of building components, different cuts with different names, like for example, strip, clamped blocks, and milkpen block. There are, however, variations of names of these cuts depending on parts of the country. Unlike neighboring countries, the swamp in Iceland, or fen or mire, which are terms that are more commonly used in Iceland, is saturated by volcanic material, basalt with rapid weathering rates, forming the fertile soil group, andosol. In short, the Icelandic wetland soil is characterized by a combination of organic material and steady flux of basaltic tephra deposition and wind-borne distribution of the parent material, which gives it its young and fertile nature. The turf houses are grounded in anarchist approaches in their building processes, while conversely they are framed within traditions and common knowledge. It has no blueprints nor official guidelines, yet emerging consensus on spatial elements and layouts, as will be explored further in Hannes' Lárusson presentation. A turf house is a cluster of houses that are connected by passageways. Back in the past, light entered the house or houses through windows made out of amniotic sacs. The cluster is an ever-changing habitat. It expanded and contracted on the basis of habitants need and use, and the division between them is unclear, and each unit connects to another to form a whole. The variation in the size is vast, from 3 to more than 30 single housing units connected by passageways, depending on the operative need and economic standard. For centuries, the baðstofa was a single unit in the cluster that served as a communal space for inhabitants, but in it people slept, worked, played, and participated in other communal activities. Interestingly, the baðstofa was both a public and private space, but the architectural structure and aesthetic qualities of the space enabled people to retrieve from communal activities by leaning back into shades or left alone in the confined space of their bed. When a turf house is built, the swamp dating 300 to 500 years according to the temporal layers, with its microbes, fungi, invertebrates, and complex plant root rhizome, starts to thrive and transform. A new composition of plants, microbes, and insect forms. In a turf house, the soil is used in the floor of the house, in the walls, and in particular form, and in particle forms saturates its air and enters the cognitive sphere or mind of its inhabitants. Thus, soil touches bodies, both outside and inside. Soil is the skin of the turf house, still restless, contagious, and odorous. Thus, the figure of the soil in a turf house, in its complex and exploded view, is in dark contrast to the solid brown mass that it is conventionally pictured. Living in a turf house is about living with the swamp, living with soil roots, coming into relations with it as a living multi-species world with biodiversity equal to tropical rainforests. A handful of soil holds millions of organisms, predators, prey, producers, consumers, and parasites. Resting on complex interactions of parent material, living organisms, and organic decomposition, soil formation is a constant process depending on climate and topography. Coming back to the turf house temporalities, as Beyakasa reminds us, the time of soil is not one. It exposes multifarious speeds of growth, becoming ecologically significant to each other. End of quote. Within the turf house, one comes in touch with webs of relations and diversity of time and physical forces and biological processes associated with deep geological time of million years and short life cycles of months, weeks, and days of, for example, protozoans, nematodes, arthropods, and not to mention the microbes, which belong to the multi-species community. The turf house contains millions of microbes belonging to hundreds of species that are competing for limited resources, signaling, reproducing, dying, or laying dormant. Under optimal conditions, many microbial cells can divide and redivide multiple times every hour, going through dozens of generations and producing millions of offsprings in less than a day. These geological and biological processes could be imagined as the house digestive system, as it continuously works and affects the house and those within it. The turf house is indeed a sensor of soil health. The walls slowly decay, and if not cared for, the house collapses. The turf house therefore unravels multiple layers of lived time, of matters and species, and the transformative nature of cohabitation when matter and species meet. As such, the turf house establishes human-soil relations, meaning living and non-living matter, and requires understanding of its complexity and human place within the soil community. From an evolutionary perspective, microbes rule the scene and have for a very long time. In fact, as microbiologists often state, we live on a planet dominated by microbes. Indeed, biologists working on symbiosis, holobionts, coevolution, and chimeric developments have brought into focus the notion of relationalities, entanglements, and interactions. Proposing a symbiotic thinking and acting, to quote Haraway again, makes us reject the notion of the bounded individual, whether we think of humans, animals, plants, or fungi. Or as stated in often cited phrase by Scott Gilbert and his collaborators, we are all lichens now. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, lichen specialists are now suggesting that the famous partnership of fungus and algae and or cyanobacteria might in fact be a partnership of three, involving proteobacteria as a third partner, central in providing protection and nutrition. Scientists estimate that human cells in our body are outnumbered by a collection of microorganisms that live in and on our body. These organisms digest food, are central to sleep cycles, clean the blood that fills our veins, counteract toxins, etc., and are therefore fundamental to human living. Just like the world of human microbiome, the turf house is a capsule for vast numbers of microbes. For instance, in one turf house that we have examined in this project, we have identified over 2,300 species. And the microbiologist Pauline Bergsten will shortly tell us more about these species, their life histories, and their wondrousness. She will also speculate on how we can invite microbes back into our lives, addressing the question, with whom would we like to live? We would like to dwell briefly with plants, and not least their roots. As often stated, the soil supports plants and plants make soil. To your right on this picture, you see a piece of turf. On the left side, you see the same picture without soil. It is a tightly knitted root sponge, unlike the prevalent wetland in the north, characterized by sphagnum moss. Icelandic swamps are characterized by rich abundance of sedge or carex, forming a closely knit rhizomes. Sedge or carex and other species such as Mars horsetail, many-headed woodrush, and meadow sweet, to name a few, that form a durable mass of roots. So when the turf building blocks that are transported from the swamp become part of the house, we witness a species turnover as the wetland plants retreat when they have this change of environment, and a new species composition forms. The plant community of the turf house contains a great species diversity, and Hjörtur Þorbjörnsson will give you further insights into the plant life system of the turf house in his talk, their networking and skills. The turf house is involved in nutrient cycles. It absorbs CO2 and fixes nitrogen. Moreover, the turf house root system forms a multiple symbiotic associations, such as fungal hyphal network through mycorrhiza, which assist the plant in nutrients uptake and exploring new niches. This partnership of fungi and plants is an ancient one, most likely since fungi and plants came into contact with land over more than 400 million years ago. Moreover, while the lichens of the turf house break rock minerals into soil, they are also sensitive bio-indicators of environmental pollution. Lichens, these ecological microcosmos, to quote Jennifer Gabriels, which grow at a slow rate and can live for over 100 of years, serve as bioindicators of pollutants such as lead, chromium, zinc, copper, fluorides, and carcinogens such as PCBs, as well as radioactive contamination. Other plants, such as mosses, are indicators for air and soil pollution, partnerships, miniature ecosystems, interactions, and parasitism abound in the turf house cluster. And Hjörtur will come back to this shortly. So, given the theoretical and practical insights that Turfiction offers, and we have so far explored, or rather exploded before you, we want to turn your attention to pressing questions about this practicality in architectural terms. The legacy of architectural modernism is grim when it comes to human relations to the non-human and what we call nature. Architectural modernism redefined human-animal-nature relationships and in fact rejected any forms of human cohabitation with animals of any kind. The extreme edition of the era is how architecture addressed hygiene, penciled out domesticated animals from any blueprints of human architecture, and brutally attacked the microbiome, the microbiome world by labeling it as life-threatening to humans. Turf houses in Iceland became a victim of modernism, as stated earlier, and shortly after the mid-20th century, they had disappeared into the ground. With it, an ontological transformation took place. The question is, however, what did we lose with that change? Is there more to the story than just the material and visual evaporation of turf houses into thin air? So, Turfiction suggests that within the post-human turn, we have an opportunity to relearn and mediate an important knowledge about the world with turf houses. As such, turf houses are technologies of post-human theories that can be put into practice. Turf houses can potentially alter perceptions of architecture that is damaged by modernism and encourage ecosystem thought for building systems that nurture relationalities and what Donna Haraway calls poetic thinking and acting. In the history of architecture, the turf house does not have a place. Architectural histories, for instance, construct their narratives on the basis of only human practices of constructing architecture. The impermanence of the turf house is opposite perceptions of architectural approaches to durability, for instance, material resilience and practical maintenance. Moreover, the notion of time in terms of architecture, its construction and maintenance has by modernist effects in particular been reduced, if not eliminated. The importance of architecture as a device for amplifying human sensitivity to non-human others, temporal diversity, engage with more than human sensing, listening, and noticing as modes of political work. To quote Anna Tsing, is huge, she says, and we contend. Architecture that directs us into relations with non-human others and makes demands on us to recognize and respond to them, to form knowledge practices and collaborations, is an act of caring. It involves, as Beyakasa states, practical involvement to look after and be affected by another. To conclude, the turf house serves as a guide, to use the words of Van Doren, to hold open space in the world for other living beings. We are in the midst of building narratives of the exploded view that we have talked about here, and where we try to answer some of the questions that we have brought up in this brief introduction. Such narratives are important for contemporary futures of architectural ecosystems. Questions that are addressed within such futurity are, for example, how is such architecture imagined, governed, and maintained? What kind of technologies are needed to create architecture of interspecies intimacies. Moreover, within such an architectural constellation, emerging questions of the lived relationalities and commons arise, like what kind of commons can it become? Thank you.
My name is Hjörtur, and I, like Sigurjón said, I am a botanist. I am the director of the Botanic Garden in Reykjavik. But first and foremost, I consider myself as a horticulturalist. I really love living plants, and so I'm not the traditional botanist who is working with dried specimens. I'm more working with living plants. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the vegetation in the swamp, and also how it changes when the swamp is extracted and built with into turf houses or other structures. So if we start with the swamp, we were very lucky to have a swamp here right outdoors. If you look at it, I believe it's from Lithuania. Like Sigurjón said, the swamps in Iceland are very much different, or perhaps not very much different, but they are different. And in someone's opinion, it's actually not a swamp, it's more like a mire or more of a bog. And in the swamp that is mainly known from Europe, the plant composition is a little bit different. There is a moss there that is called sphagnum and is very dominant in those kind of swamps. And then you have small shrubs also, like vaccinium, bog bilberries, cranberries and stuff like that. So you have also small shrubs, and you can clearly see that in the swamp outside. But in the Icelandic swamp, you have mainly grasses and sedges. Sedges are species of the genus Carex, and those are very common in the Icelandic swamp, along with the grasses. But of course, in between, you have flowering plants, and you have other species in between, the horsetail, and more. But the main composition of the turf that you can see here are the remnants of the sedges and grasses. The conditions in the swamp, they are anaerobic, and there is very slow decomposition because of that. There is a high build-up of organic material, although it is slow, like you said, it's 1 cubic millimeters per year or something. It is slow, it is slow build-up, but still it's much faster than in other places because the composition is slower in the bog. When the swamp is, or the turf is cut out of the swamp, there is a big change that happens. First and foremost, the anaerobic conditions are no more. The conditions are very much aerobic. And this turf becomes a substrate or a building material for species and organisms that are not found in the swamp. And when the turf is into the house, there is a total species turnover regarding plants. I can show you here, this is a columns of the most common species in the swamp. The names are quite small, but they do not matter in this case. The most common one is the common black sedge and the lingviaceous sedge. Those upmost two. But 5 years later, when they have been put into the house, those species completely disappear, and the common meadowgrass completely takes over and becomes very much dominant. But of course, this drastic change continues, and there is succession over the years and over the centuries, basically. And gradually, the roof and the walls, they become like this. Other species that are cohabitating our lands with the human, our crop species, our weed, they inhabit these roofs and walls, and they make the turf house their own habitation. So there is a cohabitation between plants and humans in the turf house. And so there is a change all the time. And these plants, of course, they use the substrate for their own growth, and they they gradually destroy the turf, so that in few years or several years you have to replenish it. You have to get more new turf from the swamp. But the population lives further, and the seeds are there, and the species and the populations that are on the turf, they live on, although the turf is perhaps changed. One flowering plant that is common in the swamp and actually also around the houses, that is meadowsweet. I just want to point that out because this is the plant that is in the tea can over there. It is a plant of the rose family, and I don't know, I haven't tasted the tea, but if it's done, well, meadowsweet is the first plant that aspirin was isolated from. And aspirin is the same, methyl salicylate is the same substrate from mint and wintergreen, if you know that. If you come from US, you know the taste wintergreen, often in root beers. That substrate is in the meadowsweet. So if it's correctly done and if you are sensitive to this, you will taste it, the wintergreen taste. But this is a plant from the swamp. If we want to analyze the interactions between the species, the organisms that live in the house or on the house, for that purposes I split it up into 4. So first of all, it's the inhabitants of the house. That can be human, but it's also spiders, it's lice, it's many more species. It could also be plants in some sense of it. So, but I use the word inhabitant for the human, and I'm basically meaning the humans, but that can be other species, cows, for example. And then you have the plants that are living in and on the house, and the house is just full of symbiosis, mutualism, competition, parasitism, predation, and also dependency. Last but not least, the human specifically. It's very easy to imagine the dependency of humans on plants. Basically, everything that we have in this room is built or made with some kind of a plant-based process. You would not have the plastic if it would not be the plants that lived many millions of years ago. You would not have chairs. You would not have your clothes. But basically, everything that we depend our lives on are made from plants. And then, of course, food. So we depend our lives very much on plants. And so does do other organisms that live in the house. And yes, so the house provides the substrate for plants to thrive, and just as well the inhabitants. There are also interrelations between the bacteria and the plants. Pauline will talk more about the bacteria, but I want to mention them shortly because there are two examples that are well known where bacteria and plants live in symbiosis. Approximately 1.2 billion years ago, a cyanobacteria entered a eukaryotic cell, which gave birth to the plants as we know them today, photosynthesizing plants. Photosynthesizing organism has the ability to draw carbon from the atmosphere and make it into a substrate and makes the carbon enter the carbon cycle or into the soil. So ever since that occasion when the cyanobacteria entered the eukaryotic cells, we have plants, and ever since we have had oxygen in the air. The oxygen just increased, and it is the basis of life as we know it today. More recent, and it probably happened many times, there was a bacteria that is called Rhizobium, which started a symbiosis with plants, and they live in the roots and they draw nitrogen from the air. So again, this symbiosis between bacteria and plants are very important for our well-being and most animals' well-being, because they make the substrate that we can grow from and is the source of our food. The relationship between plants and fungi are very complex and it is something that has not been looked upon as much as it should have been. And it's not quite, well, it's quite recently that people are starting to realize the importance of this. And basically all plants that are growing outside, they have some sort of a symbiotic relationship with fungi. And often more than one species of fungi. It can be 2, 3, perhaps much more. I haven't found any references about that, but it is known that it's very much. And you can see the Ericaceae, the small shrubs in the bog outside, all of them have very intricate symbiotic relationship with the fungi. And the fungi provides the plant with mineral nutrients and water from the soil. And also it gives the plants more resilience to environmental stress. And the fungi are big players in the nutrient cycling. 80% of the nitrogen that the plants take from the soil are via that fungal symbiosis. And in return, the plant gives the fungi 15% of their carbon. So it's not even. it's very much, on the other one side. And then, of course, we have this arrow here between the inhabitants and fungi. Of course, I was going to talk about plants, so I'm not going to focus on this. But I wanted to mention this also because in our mind and in our world as it is today, we consider fungi something that is bad. We become sick from fungi. If fungi is on our skin, we are sick. And if fungi are in our houses, we have like these sicknesses that come from that. So to my knowledge, there is not much of a good symbiotic relations directly between fungi and the inhabitants of the turf house. But if you think about the relationship between the plants and the fungi, then we definitely depend very much on the fungi and the knowledge that we can perhaps draw from those kind of symbiotic relations. And then I also wanted to mention the relationship between bacteria and fungi, and that is because we have this very well-known case of symbiotic relationship, which is called the lichen, which is a symbiotic relationship between algae and fungi and then bacteria. So, basically, we have something that is not so easy to put borders between, and gradually everything just comes together. So even though it can be done to try to make a exploded view of it, it somehow comes together all in one in the end. So, thank you.
So, hi everybody, my name is Colin Bergsen and I'm doing my PhD in Iceland. I'm studying microbes from a volcano, but today we are going to speak about the microbes inside of the turf houses. So, how you can see on this slide, it's the last version of the Tree of Life, published by the Dr. Butfield and her colleagues in 2016. It's a diagram outlining the evolution of all living things on Earth. It's based on the DNA sequencing, which allows the scientists to find the relationship among the species encoded in their genes. But it's a little bit a complicated tree, but the only message that I want to say here is that much of the Earth biodiversity is bacteria. You can find all of these branches are bacteria, and then we have the archaea and the eukaryotes. And the human is just at the bottom of one branches of the eukaryotes. So you can see that it's like the world is very diverse in bacteria. Bacteria play an essential role in the ecosystem of our planet. For instance, perform the important role of breaking down dead organisms as plants or insects into the basic nutrients that are essential for life. They are found everywhere, including in inhospitable places as subglacial lakes or in volcanic vents in the deep sea, or even in boiling hot springs. They could possibly even live on Mars if they could get there. So compared to human and any other animals, they can consume and grow on almost everything. They can consume each other. They can consume sunlight. They can consume also pure nitrogen or sulfur. They are responsible for creating many of the food that we are eating, like wine or cheese, beer, or even yogurt. The human body is also full of microbes. We have microbes on our skin, in our gut, in our mouth. They are all around us. When, you are probably aware that most of the bacteria are harmless to humans. Just a small fraction can cause disease. The others are important for keeping you healthy and fending off infection. They can have a profound effect on your health and even on your behavior and even your mood. So in so many ways we are our microbes, and plants are like us. There is recent estimates that show that the vast majority of the plants contain bacteria also inside of their tissues, and they have impact on them as our microbes have impact on us, and they can be good or bad. So since bacteria are so important for our environment and for us, why are we trying to exclude them from our life? So today we are living in this kind of houses. I mean, I don't know where you live, but modern houses where everything is clean, where it's sort of sterile, far away of the ground and its biodiversity, where there is no place for nature, where certain species of bacteria are excluded. But why? What if it was wrong to exclude them? So, in turf houses, inhabitants were surrounded by microorganisms from the environment, and most likely they were interacted with them. So we went into turf houses in Iceland and took samples to study the microbes that were inside of the turf house. Sorry, I don't know why I'm because the turf house microbiome never had been studied before, and so we took samples from the air, from the air inside of the turf house, outside. We took samples inside of the wall. In order to describe what you can find there, and try to be able to say if they are good or bad. As stated earlier, we found 1,600 species of bacteria and 700 species of eukaryotes. So I will not enter into details in this diagram, but it just means that the microbiome of the turf house is very rich. We sampled the swamp as well, and we wanted to do a comparison of the microbial communities between the turf and the swamp, but we didn't got the result yet. But as Sjörtur said before, for the plants, we observe that they observe a complete turnover of the plant that you can find in the swamp and in the turf, and it is most likely the same for the bacteria. We also investigate the microbial communities inside of the wall of the turf house, and so you can see here it's like the outside of the wall from the inside, and you can see that there is differences between the location inside of the wall. And also from the air, we just suck the air like 1,000 liters of air, and we just analyze what we could find inside. And so we arrived to the conclusion that inside of the Pastova, so the common area inside where people were living, there was much more diversity inside of the turf house than outside. Which is surprising. And so back to our laboratory, we try to cultivate bacteria from the turf, and in total we isolated 100 colonies and 30 different species. We selected 10 isolated bacteria from the turf here, so you will be able to look at them. They are dead, so don't worry. And almost all of them are already known, the one that we managed to isolate it from the turf. And they live in diverse environments such as soil, fresh water, in the rhizosphere, or in symbiosis with plants. However, 2 strains have been that have been isolated from the air of the turf house are completely new species. And which means that they never have been discovered before, or at least never described. And we bring one here so you can see new species. Well, so maybe now we can speculate about the fact that microbes are not all bad, and we need them, and so why we shouldn't invite microbes back into our life, why not into our home, into our kitchen. Maybe we can design houses with a part of the floor that is brown, or where you have walls made of plants or fungi or full of microbes. We all have a microbial cloud around us, which is an identity because it's different from a person to another. I know that there is like a new technology to identify someone with the microbial cloud that is around you. And so maybe in the future we will enter a house just by coming next to it, and it will be like your key, which will be like very personal key that you can give to someone else. I mean, I think it should be an open conversation, but do you want to? Yeah, I think I will give you the petri dishes.
So, hi everybody, my name is Hannes, as you see on the screen, and as introduced by Sigurjón, as a guest of that you have the feeling of the turf. This is turf in the boxes here. So if you take the turf and then pass it on, so people can open the box and feel the turf in there. I think it's important before we start. I'm representing a small institution in Iceland, but with a very big ambitions, because we are covering 1100 of neglected history, 1100 years of neglected history, meaning the turf house heritage. And we'll just browse through this quickly. And it's concerned with preserving the heritage, information on the heritage, but and partly the lifestyle, but also the workmanship of these houses, and the tools and the know-how you need to have in order to build houses like this. and there is one sample of two that is necessary in order to cut this. Absolutely impossible to cut this except with a very sharp knife and also the right technique. You can try to cut later on without technique and a sharp knife, you're not getting anywhere. And if you say, I don't need a knife, I rip it with my hands, I'm strong, you can't do it. But I encourage you to try. Both rip it, try to rip it, and also try to cut it. It's not dangerous, it's fun. So it's the tools, and you not only need turf cutting tools, you need woodworking tools, blacksmithing tools, and you need a paintbrush also, because you might want to paint the house, so it's not all grey and brown or blackish. It is good to have colors to it, and it's also part of the tradition to be able to recognize potency of colors and paint. So this is two words that you need to know, should be in the Webster dictionary. You should just be able to look at that, because it's almost impossible to translate these two words. One means the turf house cluster, the Icelandic cluster, and baðstofa, the second word, means the main living space in Icelandic turf house. The Icelandic house, not in the ice that is to say the Icelandic house, because Icelanders lived in a house of that height more or less for more than 1,000 years. It's a relatively long in the history of Western civilization. We could stretch it back perhaps 6,000 years. So 1,000 out of 6,000 is a pretty long time to spend in a mud house. And this is what I call it. I call it a vernacular curiosity, because it is vernacular, and it is for most of you only a curiosity because you never heard of it before. So it's something new. But instead of going to Africa, you go up north. And there you find a vernacular curiosity, which is the mud houses of the Icelanders, called Bær. If you go inside, this is what you see. You find people there, you find the microbes or the bacteria, and the insect spiders, blacksmiths, and the housefly, and also people. And this is where Iceland is. You might have difficulties seeing where it is because it's up north. It almost blends into the North Pole. It's actually on the Arctic Circle, so it's out of. It's a detour going to Iceland. So, and this is the truth. I don't have to read this. We've limited time, but you see what it means, and this is what the turf looks like in the real habitat. This is where you cut the turf, and then it looks like this close up. And I am, as you might think, or might suspect, or might guess, that I'm representing the Aboriginals. I'm representing the original breed that actually lived in the turf houses. So you could call me a indigenous or Aboriginal or a nomad. But this is me. I'm right there. I was practically born in the turf house, and so I'm the only person in here that I'm pretty sure that have a big quantity of microbes originated in the turf and in the turf houses, because that's where I come from. So taking samples from my gut would be, you would find resemblances to what you find in the turf. And as Aboriginals, they usually come from earth houses. They come from houses that are built from, not from this artificial material made in German property, or the plastics, not built from that, because that is supposed to last forever, like the European cathedrals and Colosseum and Greek Roman architecture. and plastics. It's the opposite when it comes to many of the houses of the indigenous people. They build out of material that is not lasting. It might last a lifetime if you're lucky. Often doesn't even last the winter or the summer. But a lifetime is a general rule. If it lasts a lifetime, it's pretty good. So, but it needs rebuilding. It's made out of organic material like this. This will eventually decay and become earth. Eventually, because the microbes are always on it. So they're not giving up until they've destroyed it completely. Not destroyed it, but made it into earth or mud, but not building blocks like bricks. So this is what you should be able to read, and they read this quickly. You might look it up in your cell phones. See this, and then this is a definition of it. And but it's not like that, not yet. So and this is very. There's a loudspeaker up there. See. So this is the turf. This is how it's cut, and this is where it comes from. Comes from the wetland, soaking wet. It's heavy. It's unforgiven material. If you are problems in your guts, problems in your legs, in your back, in your neck, you can't cut turf. If you're hungry, you can't cut turf. You have to be in good shape. It's heavy and unforgiving. And this is how you do it. So if you have a group of people like we are, we could build a turf house in a week. Easily. Not only one house, but the whole cluster. Because it's all based on manpower. So the rebuilding is like this. This is what you are faced with. The house has been lasted a lifetime. And then when the lifetime is over, then you pass it on, and the one you pass it on to has to make a decision. Am I going to renew the contract with the house, and with the land, and with the turf? So I'm going to give it back. So that's the decision the next generation is making. And Icelanders, they made up their mind, almost everybody at the same time, and said, or came to the conclusion, we are not going to renew the contract. It's over. The lease is over. We're going to give everything back, we are moving out. But if you say, I'm going to renew the contract, this is what you do. You take it down and you rebuild it. That's the burden of the Aboriginals. They have to rebuild. Unlike the Romans and the Italians. So this is what it looks like. Endless variations, because this is the, as I said earlier, the prevailing material and the prevailing building style. And you might say, it's not surprising that it has a pitched roof. But it is rather surprising, because there are not many pitched roofs in Venice, and not many pitched roofs in Greenland, and not many pitched roofs in Central Africa or in the warm places. Most places are warm in the world, and even too warm. Very few places are too cold. So there are flat roofs, even in Greenland. It's cold and dry. And in Africa, it's also cold and dry. And you might be optimistic and say, are they still building houses like this in Africa and Greenland? No, not quite. Modernism and modern life and plastics and this stuff has caught up with them also. So this is what they built in Greenland, and this is what they built in Africa, in Khartoum. I think they're becoming like us, more or less. So, and this is what we are faced with. wet, cold and windy. And you only have to be in Venice for a couple of days to find out that this is not the prevailing condition in the world. Very few places, as a matter of fact, have this condition, wet, cold and windy. They might have wet, but then it's not cold. Might be windy, but then it's neither cold or wet. But to have the combination of wet, cold and windy is almost extreme. So it was probably never meant to be lived in a place like Iceland, as you see. I mean, who wants to live there for 1100 years? It is. And but that's what it did. And if you do something repeatedly, you find out, some of you are still students, we are all students, all learning. And we don't have to be students for long to find out if you do something over and over again, repeat it over and over again, if you cut turf over and over again, day after day you're cutting turf. In the end you become good at it. That's almost a general rule. So if you repeat things, you always become slightly better until you stagnate and then things deteriorate again. But that's a general rule. So it happened with the first settlers. They started from scratch, as you see, very simple and crude and boring and ugly and simple house. The big houses of the Vikings. Everybody in here can build a house like the Vikings. Very easy. You can do it in a few days even, with a few people helping you. But 1,000 years later, these complexes are very difficult to build and even very difficult to design. And like nobody in here would ever think of designing a house that looks like this. It's almost impossible to design, but almost impossible to build, because it's not for one generation to build. It is for the kind of a millennium to build a house like this. You add to it, and it becomes a big complex. And as it happens, where do Icelanders know that? This house down there is 5 times bigger than even the biggest Viking house. So clusters like this is what Icelanders lived in one way or another, for these 1100 years. And this is what it looks like. Just browse through it quickly. But you see the cluster there, important concept, because that is the central concept of Icelandic architecture, the cluster. This is the cluster. We have a big cluster of houses. Icelandic turf house is minimum 10-15 houses, but up to 20-25 houses. And big farms up to 50 houses. These farms are fairly big, both of them. You could easily count more than 30 houses for both of them. More like on this one on the left, 50 houses. And then we're including the houses of animals, of course, and they all have different names in the cluster, so it's not big, because if you do this for 1,000 years, you find a name for it. You will not say just a house. You say the baðstofa, you say skemma, you say búr, there's a name for every part of the house, because 1,000 years later you found a name for what you're doing. That's what happened. And this is the basic module. You might think it's all chaos. The Icelanders, Aborigines and Iceland didn't know how to build houses. It was even digging out and the dugouts and digging holes and crawling into the hole, burrows of different type. But that is not the case, because there is a basic module that is repeated almost with very, very little difference from one house to another. So this is the basic the basic module. Very, very circular, because we are not Neolithic. We are Iron Age perhaps, or medieval. We are not stretching as far back as to the Neolithic. It's making circles of it. So it's rectangular. That is the prevailing module in all of the houses, and then the idea is to so this is the same thing, and so So the idea is to combine these modules together and make up the cluster. So this is just browsing to things that you might know. I'm not sure where to see. Iceland is up there. And Greenland is North Pole. And we are the tectonic plates. They moved away and left a small piece of earth in between the two tectonic plates, Europe and North America, and that happens to be Iceland. Sitting on the middle of the Atlantic Ridge. That's why we have this volcanic activity like this, steam coming out of the earth, and then eruptions, which are important part of this is ash, especially in south of Iceland, in the turf. Makes it one of the things that makes it a unique material. And then we have the Gulf Stream. Without the Gulf Stream, we would be under ice, and then we would be part of the North Pole. You would not even see Iceland, because it would be under ice completely without the Gulf Stream. So, and then this is economics, fish, and economics in Iceland is very simple. It is this, steam, geothermal is a keyword you have to learn. We go to Iceland, geothermal, and it is fish, two pillars in the economy in Iceland. And the third pillar is electricity, which we all sell to big foreign companies. Over 90% of the electricity is sold to aluminum smelters and international companies, big industry. Three pillars: fish, geothermal, and electricity. And you might guess what is the name of this piece. You can see this is art, but behind this electric pole. But it happens to be called electricity, the sculpture. And one of the most famous Icelandic modern sculptor. So this is what Iceland looked like 100 years ago. You would not find any house different than a turf house. It would only be turf house. Driving around Iceland or riding on a horseback around Iceland or walking around Iceland. You walk along the shore because most of the inhabitants live on the shore, and 100 years ago most of the people lived in the countryside. So 80%, more than 80% of the population in Iceland lived in houses like this 100 years ago. So you might just have to read this, and this is regarding this from an aesthetic point of view, which we are not really doing when we are talking about the houses of vernacular houses, aboriginal houses. When we talk about the teepees and the igloos and the Icelandic turf house, you are not using aesthetic analysis. You do it when you go to the Palazzo San Marco, then you do it. But when you go to Iceland, just leave the aesthetic approach behind. But I'm not agreeing with that, so I'm applying aesthetic analysis to the turf house. Turf house tradition. It's a long tradition, and as I was saying, as a matter of fact, not only a long tradition, but the presentation is also too long already, as I've been pointed out. And I barely started. Long history. So, but still, you don't want to miss this. And this is the truth. And this is the old chief, sitting on the bed in the old house. This is the house. This happens in the 50s. This is the new house. Le Corbusier, inspired by Le Corbusier. High modernism, built in the early 50s. And this is not fantasy because I practically was brought up next door. I met this guy when I was young, but I don't remember. Too young. So, and then, because we have a loudspeaker up there, then you can have sound. So, this is what you sacrificed. You got this instead. But they sacrificed this. The medievalism and microbes got this instead. And this woman might be alive. It's such a short history, and the transformation is so quick and so profound and so brutal that some of us in here, I mean the Icelanders, might have met this woman. So, and no wonder that everything coming from Iceland is sad and tragic, and yeah, but this is what it looks like today. So, if this would be a genuine presentation, this would be the end of it. We will do this over. But I'm going to continue. But anyway, this is Iceland as it is today. You don't want to move there, none of you. It's wet, cold and windy, and I'm not exaggerating. And it's sad on top of that. It's not Elvis Presley. There's no rock and roll. These guys are there. And they made the decision. Get rid of it. And they, unanimous decision. And this is what it is today. This is how it is today. It's all over. And we talked about the Talibans in Iceland. And beautiful house, last house in Reykjavík. What did they do with it? You might already know the Icelandic mentality by now. What did they do? It doesn't come as a surprise. It's the only natural thing to do in Iceland. Destroy heritage and history. You are not even Icelander if you are not doing that. And there is, if you look at this in UNESCO terms, from point of view UNESCO, there is something called heritage at risk. Iceland, 1100 years of Icelandic heritage is beyond risk. That means the patient is, if it is a health risk, you might be healed if you eat turf or something, get microbes back in shape. But if it's beyond risk, then the patient is dying. So this is beyond risk in Iceland. And this is one of the last frontiers. We are fighting for this. We don't want to give it away. We are not prepared to do that. And we are fighting for this. We are not going to give up. This is the house of the hobbits. Bilbo Baggins lived there. But the Icelanders have the mental suite in the roof. Looks like this. And then, as a byproduct of this, not only destroying heritage, but also destroying the turf. This is how you destroy turf. By digging ditches and draining it completely. If you drain it completely, it's like burning a jungle. Burning a jungle means that you are emitting CO2 in big quantities, and 70% of the CO2 emission in Iceland comes from destroying turf. It's like burning a jungle, but takes 20 years instead of a couple of weeks. So this is how to do it. And these guys helped us a lot. This is General Marshall, right there. Some of you in here might have benefited from the Marshall Plan. Italians benefited a lot from it, most European countries, and we benefited a lot from it, the Icelanders, but we had to pay for it with modernization, get rid of the heritage, and drain the marshland, and then believe in electricity and geothermal. That's the new gods in Iceland. So it's already over, but still you are architects and you see how difficult it is to design a turf house. There you see it, black and white. Very difficult, even difficult to draw it, not to mention build it. So it's even for me, the aboriginal that know these houses inside out, I make mistakes and mix things up. Even if it's a very simple module that is always repeated, still you mix things up. You forget to put the door into the right place and things like that. So even you lose patience already now, looking at me drawing the turf house, not to mention to build it in real size, and the turf house is big. So yeah, this is it. This is a genuine turf house, but not without faults. I see it now. I could have done a better job. So it's, but still, could be worse. And now we go quickly. It's over. This is just you read this quickly. It's just pointing out that we are not basing this on the Greek Roman symmetry and classicism, based on something else, on different things. As you see, it's a crazy aesthetics, but still harmony. And this is now I'm going to stop talking. You only look, and then you see where it gets them, or gets us. So it's not all lost. I'm exaggerating. There are a few houses preserved in Iceland. So these are old houses, and but this is the communism. Talking about communism, that's where you have it. This is communism. You're not only living with people, you're living with the microbes and the bacteria and the insects and mice and lice and dogs and cats and even cows and sheep. And you live in a space where you do absolutely everything. Do everything in space. You conceal the children, you give birth to the children, you eat, sleep, and you recycle things. You eat what you recycle, what you eat, you recycle it inside the house. And that's communism on a grand scale. And we don't want to go into the details, but pointing out that when we are going into history like this, then we have to ask the question, what is worth preserving? One thing worth preserving is the turf, but another thing is some aesthetic elements, like when you build a space over and over again for 30 generations, and then there is something that is very difficult to improve. That's one of the things you want to preserve. The main living room that have taken 30 generations to refine and make like this. I'm not going to go into the fine details of analyzing it, but this is it's more or less the same everywhere in Iceland, like this. But all of them, I would say these are most of these are preserved or semi-preserved beyond what you could really improve. This is pretty good as it is. If we go inside of this house, it looks like this. So they look like houses, not dugouts or burrows or caves. It looks like houses, as a matter of fact. Might be a surprise. Some of them are badly preserved, as you see, and ugly because of bad preservation. Some of them are gone. This is gone. Beautiful, beautiful space. And you see, some of these houses have been painted, and that's why you need to have some grasp of the brush and pigment. This is the ugliest thing. This happens to be the National Museum. This is full of garbage. Because not even the microbes would like to live in there. This is a guy tearing down a turf house. Happy guy. And it's drawn to an end. I have been comparing this to the Japanese tea house. I've been calling it the tea house of the north. Because there are not many spaces in the up north that are more refined than this house, because we've been doing it for such a long time, 30 generations. A Norwegian log house is not as old as that, and the Irish stone house is 200 years old, perhaps, oldest. And this is where we are at, fighting for this, not giving up, hopefully. And when you are taking up a fight, then you have to call on the spirits to help you. You can't do it alone. You have to apply communism. And this is communism in practice. You call on the good spirits, wherever you find them, to help you. Even the aliens are, if they are on your side, if all these guys are on your side, you're going to win this battle. And you might have seen that the guy that designed the house, he has the brain cap on, and if he are not forgetting about the brain, we might win the battle. And then this is where we are at right now. Not forgetting the microbes or the elements, but as you know, who is the enemy? Why do we need all the spirits? Why is it not enough to have the aliens on our side? And not even enough to have Alvarado and Le Corbusier on our side? Not enough. Who are the enemies? These are the enemies that we're up against. The bureaucrat and the technocrat. And I'm sorry to say that some of you might become either of these guys. Because some of us have no other choice. Either you become a bureaucrat or a technocrat, or you just become mud. So these are the antidotes. Fagurfræði, the science of beauty. It's the Icelandic word for it. It's aesthetics. But there are two things that you need to have in order to fight, to win any battle. You need this. Not enough. You need this also. But if you have these two things, and the aesthetics is also on your side, then you might win. And I hope so that we will win in the end. In the name of aesthetics. Thank you.
I hope you feel my pain that I come after my colleague with this sort of very explicit presentation. Now, my name is Hildigunnur Sverrisdóttir. I'm an architect and educator. And I want to start by visiting a theory that has been discussed in previous lectures. Can you hear me? Is it okay? But I want to allow myself to go into more pedagogic details since it sort of serves for our history. French philosophers Deleuze and Guattari described in their book 1,000 Plateaus a binary conceptual division of space, the smooth and the striated space. The smooth space is, if you will, the space of the nomad, and the space of the sedentary is this so-called striated space, the measured space. You will have in the striated space the organized space, something that derived from the polis, the city-state, where people had to start to organize and sort of calculate how to distribute the goods, how to distribute the time of people, and so on. And so it's very much the space of the Excel sheets, the space of the measurement and displacement. Whereas the smooth space is in the realm of pure nature. It's unaccountable, it's vast, it's completely useless as a base of orientation. And this could, for example, be the space of the desert or the glacier or the ocean, somewhere where you can't really orient yourself except through haptic experience, where the other is more optical. You can always sort of calculate and see and so on. Now, again, the smooth space is the space of the war machine, where you go on to the war with just like a vector of intention to win. And you can see the States of America, for example, in the south. You will see the borders very much sort of following the canyons and the lines of the landscape, whereas the upper states are more or less done by rulers through the striated sort of negotiation of the countries that divided them between them. Now, the smooth and the striated space only consists in context with the other. So you will have smooth space almost always defined by a striated space. There's always a sort of finish to the sea, for example, with the shoreline. There is the farmer's border on the desert and so on. And the striated space, in return, almost always dissolves into smoothness through shanty towns, through suburbs, through urban sprawl and things like that. Now, they also describe in their passage how this translates to materials and ideas, how the nomads used the felt to cover as tents, as clothes, weapons, shields, and they were carrying their livestock with them, so they could always just take new wool from the livestock. And in a sense, that's a material that is never finished. You can always add on to it. There are no borders, there are no fronts or backs. And the interesting thing here is, especially in the context that we've been proposing to you, the individuals are not necessarily the same. So you can have a multitude of individuals that are more or less felted into the same sort of piece of material. On the other side, as the polis and then the cities became more sophisticated, people started taking the felt or the wool, making threads, weaving, and then we had weaving sort of mills as we got along through the ages. And this space is very much striated through the Euclidean space that I was mentioning before, the extra sheets of the perpendiculars, the parallels. And here, you will see that all the individuals in the matter are the same, or replica of the same, which also reflects very much in the sort of modernist way of living, where people are getting more and more confined to the same kinds of roles and so on. Now, however, they also describe how even the most striated material, the machine-woven fabric, for example, can become nomadic in nomadic contexts. And this, for example, is true for the American immigrations, where settlers would move to America with their woven fabrics from their previous countries. But in a new place, in the absence of the striated context, these became nomadic in a sense. So you would have maybe the curtains that became the coats of the father, then the dresses of the mothers, then the dresses for the children, and then end up in patchworks that very much behave in the nomadic sense, that these are just pieces of fabric that sort of have no beginning or no end, if you will, because you can always add on to it. Now, I introduce you to these ideas as I feel that they very well describe the condition of the turf house. As Deleuze and Guattari state, one spatial condition is never without the other, and the striated space always dissolves into a smooth space. And that sort of means that we can also have a condition called striated smooth space. And that's very much the sort of beginning of our, like Hannes has been going through before. The settlers would sort of choose their place according to winds and weather, and sort of thrust their bodies into that flesh of the earth and sort of pull up, if you will, the sheltering the walls. And this, if you will, making ways for the construction, but in the context of the turf house, it is interesting to see how it becomes nomadic through time. Like Hannes was telling you before, this has to be renewed across the generations. So after digging himself into the mire, or more accurately, sort of taken from the mire, of course, it is in a sense very much like the felt tent. You can adjust it with feathers. You can almost sort of move it by sort of striking yourself in this sort of fleshy earth. And as with the tents of the nomads, it can sort of be laid down to smaller units or fewer units. And when the conditions get better, you add on to it according to what each generation finds suitable. Now, the structure of the building itself, as a point of depart, has recurring similarities, like Hannes was introducing to us in his talk, according to time, according to social status, but most importantly, according to access to materials. And close to the sea, the farmers could reuse timber from driftwood or stranded sheets to panel their buildings. But one of the sort of recurring themes is the ingenious way of burying, if you will, the building with the turf walls into this flesh of the earth, like I was saying before, and they would try to get whatever heat they possibly could with animals and so on, which has been gone through. Heat seeking upwards, they made a great sort of deal out of this, and one of the super interesting thing is, and ingenious, is the fact that by making these turf walls the way they are, you are in a sense digging the house under the freezing line. So you can sort of add on to whatever ground you have and isolate or insulate your house in a very fantastic way. Another thing also with this situation of earthquakes that we have, we were talking about volcanic eruptions before, but it's also a question of earthquakes. And even though the houses not necessarily would be completely whole afterwards, they are sort of, you have these extremely delicate and refined wooden buildings or stone buildings within the flesh of the earth, being more or less able to move with the earth in earthquakes. Now, multiple relations between humans and non-humans in the turf house have already been discussed, but I would like to add a short narrative of how crucial relationship between humans and stones. It's an interesting thing that in this context, that even though stone itself was all around us in mountains and so on, the act of getting a stone was extremely difficult, simply because people didn't have calories, they didn't have fuel, they didn't have energy enough to send people up to the mountains to cut out the stone. So as a result, the stone became almost like a heritage. A good building stone would become a heritage that went from one generation to the next. And that sort of becomes an interesting thing, especially in the context of how we usually look at stone. We usually look at stones as a given, as a sort of very striated in terms of steadfast buildings, more or less the same units, and so on and so on. But the Icelandic stone is relatively porous, like we talked about before. Both the relatively young basalt and particularly the lava makes it very sort of porous. And we live on a tundra belt, which means that it's freezing and thawing all the time, which erodes the stone, at quite a big pace. And and also with the microbes, with the plants and so on, these will deteriorate through time, and thus becoming this nomad, if you will, that has to be re-maintained and rebuilt constantly. Another, because we have been, of course, the theme of this school is the commons, if you will, I would also like to mention a little bit the social context of the farmhouse. There were no general infrastructures in Iceland in the old time. There were no road systems. there were no inns or sort of hotels or hostels that you could stay at. So that means that the most private of the habitats, the lawn in front of your house, actually became a replacement, if you will, for the town square. People would have to sort of, on one hand, ride through your land, and you would have to allow them to do so, because otherwise you couldn't, go anywhere yourself. And also that this sort of proximity of your house had to be open, since there was very little possibilities, except for churches, for people to meet, apart from very specific, occasions like the parliament or so on. Another interesting thing is that as people came to visit, the beds of the inhabitants themselves became lodging for visiting strangers. And even to the excess that because people were married sometimes and they would share beds together, you wouldn't put a baby or a man next to a traveling man. So actually the young women of the houses would sometimes be used to heat up the traveling strangers, which probably saved us from becoming, completely inbred, if you will. But there's this sort of beautiful understanding of the commons that comes completely intuitively to us, if you will. And in a sense, in the small community that we have, we're only 350,000 people living on a huge country of 110,000 square kilometers. We still need this sort of, you could call it nepotism, but we still need this sort of commonism to be able to thrive. It was mentioned a little bit before that in most senses these buildings are anarchistic. So it follows the rules of intuition, the embedded situated knowledge of the farmers themselves, taking on whichever form that was deemed necessary or approachable. And then came modernism. Hannes showed a newer version of a modernist house, but you can see here the rectangular building over there, which is the sort of first of the new stone buildings that were actually, because we didn't have the technology at the time, was quite cold. So some of the elders and the youngers would actually go to the turf house to maintain the heat from there. But we also see that the barns and the outhouses were actually still in this sort of nomadic way of just being reconstructed and added onto and sort of whatever you needed, whatever materials you could get at the co-op at the same time, you sort of use that to sort of add on and build to. And in the end, the old way of building, based on the materials that you could access, actually translated into the younger buildings in the towns and even in farmhouses of today. This is sort of newly done up, but underneath or when it was built, it was probably built with many different types of materials, but still in this sort of agglomeration of houses. We were talking about beautiful living, or Hannes mentioned aesthetic living, and I also want to come with a little pedagogical input here, because it seems that we are always struggling with the word aesthetics and beauty, and we seem to have like a very sort of slippery grip on that concept. But if you look at the Greek sort of root of this word, aesthetics, it sort of comes to meaning I perceive, I feel, I sense. And if you go into poesis, which is sort of if you talk about poetic living, we could talk about beautiful living or aesthetic living. Living beautifully or living poetically means in turn the term to make, but not any kind of making. This word was first a verb. It is actually an action that transforms and continues the world. And poetic work reconciles thought with matter and time, and the person with the world. So it's not technical, it's not necessarily romantic. It is, in a sense, an intuitive going on, keeping on with life and the world. The German philosopher Heidegger wrote extensively about poetic living and dwelling, and actually coins this co-living with the terminology of the word dwelling. Dwelling is not merely a spatial thing, it is very much a temporal one. One stays within a space through time, and thus understands and becomes one, always re-questioning, always, in a sense, also answering the question of what that space can be and wants to be. In the contemporary world, this is becoming more and more challenging. In the words of the Toulousean feminist theorist Rósa Breiðadóttir, who has written extensively on nomadism, we have become non-unitary subjects in the system of capitalism. So we move around, we are shuffled, because this makes dwelling, sort of being in a place, learning to understand and live with it, so difficult. We are shuttling ourselves around the world in a very nomadic terms, both as a proletariat looking for better wages elsewhere, as tourists, but also, like you probably see and we feel here today, as academians, as professionals, as theorists, diplomats, we seem to be moving all around the globe. And this calls for, if you will, quick fixes and quick buildings that cost the Western world much less, sadly, than rebuild. It's much sort of cheaper to rebuild a house than to maintain an old house, simply because we are getting extremely cheap material for people that then in turn are paying our prices for their work and their resources. Surely we live in a completely different technological context that the farmers in the turf house did, but technology has also come up with quick fixes that are supposed to save the world, but then again are not intuitively made to understand how time, temporality, and sort of influences have on the social context. But these can be used, if we will, to maybe in a more slower way, in more in the sort of terms of the dwelling, maybe be sort of reintroduced and through time understood in the context of sort of a new way of living. Now, within the group, we have had a case study, or several case studies, but maybe this is the most important one, a trial to embrace not only the local and traditional knowledge or sustainable fashion of today, but Hannes Lárusson has built sort of his proposition at the time to the intersection of the local, traditional, and sustainable, and what that would mean using the former materials in the context of, for example, in situ cast concrete, and with the sort of technologies of today, going to the length of redefining what we call local material. Since we're shifting materials all over the world all the time, we also have foreign materials in many places that have become local because they're there, simply there. And this, for example, the floor are kitchen tops that were supposed to be, before the crash in Iceland, everyone was throwing out the kitchens and making like really sleek new kitchens. And there was like a multitude of materials that were supposed to be thrown away. Now, Hannes retrieved this and sort of proposed a new way of treating this now local material, along with trying to, with a greenhouse that has sort of a soily floor, because we have extreme weather conditions. We have sun all night long during the summertime, and then winter is extremely dark. And the sun only comes to about 6 degrees over the horizon. So there is a greenhouse that actually is situated in a way that it tries to optimize the warmth of the sun throughout the year. Our next endeavor will be, like Hannes also discussed a little bit, to make a poetic building to an already existing turf house that suffers from grave malnourishment, as you can see. A building that could cohabit and host the contemporary functions that we need to vitalize this house, but at the same time, again, re-questioning how do you sort of embrace the beauty, the knowledge that this house encounters, and or not encounters, that it sort of has built in it, at the same time as we, with our new ways, try to lies a new way of dealing with it. Now we have new conditions, especially in the wake of modernist times, where a great amount of building grows without special sort of intuitive regards to the ontological needs of the humans. We have had the century to learn from them. Of course, they were children of the time. It was a question of hygienics. It was a question of women coming out, having been on the work market and needing a workspace at home, letting in sun and wind and sun and air and so on. But these, like I said, after the century of experience, we have, at least many of us, come to the conclusion that phenomenological and ontological aspects of them are greatly lacking or suffering. Now, there has been a wave amongst architects that resent the demolition of these buildings, since they are now local materials, they are built, they are there. And with architects, we see architects like Lárusson and Vassal in France experimenting and finding new ways to reappropriate these buildings, especially in the context of both amongst immigrants, but also new sort of fashions of living together multi-generationally, in different forms of families. And what I also find very interesting is that through additions and appropriations, these are transformed, and we could almost talk about nomadic conditions there. But one of the things that they find important to keep is, in fact, the cultural memory of these places, that there is actually a history of people having lived there, that they take in as a quality. Now, to come back to the turf house, we are not proposing, like you probably hear, a definite new way of doing technological interventions or revisiting the turf house exactly as it were and rebuilding turf houses, but rather try to learn from it in a poetic and sometimes very fictional way, to ask this sort of, at least in our view, this wise, knowledgeable brain, this sensory cohabitation of all kinds of or multiple of species, what it can teach us and how it can guide us maybe to new ways through time and space, and dwelling, like we talked before, and in the ways of Donna Haraway, how we can become critters, like we sort of, try to take us all onto the same level, trying to, not that is possible since we are the subjects speaking about it, but how can we invent new ways to speak in a post-humanistic or in another sort of human sort of centric way about this co-living, this sort of symbiotic biosystem that is in fact a multiple host of the turf house. Like you've heard today, I mean, it's not only the people themselves that are the hosts, it's very much this agglomeration or a compilation of different agents. So the turf house is for us maybe simultaneously a brain, an intestine, an amniotic sac. We have amniotic glasses there if you want to look at the world through the amniotic sac. The womb that sort of surrounds us and protects, but also has brought light in and maybe been the membrane that sort of allowed this communication with nature and given birth to sort of evolving conditions through this cohabitation in this ecosystem. So, if you will, we have come to learn, of course, that there are no sort of non-maintainable materials. We know that everything, every steel thing, every concrete thing gathers and in a sense not necessarily welcomes, but will through time be attacked by some outside forces. The problem is that they're not designed that way. So we always have this problem of fault-ridden buildings because they are simply not thought as communicative with the surroundings. I think in a sense that's one of the sort of primal factors of our questioning is how can we learn, how can we reappropriate or appropriate. this embedded knowledge within the turf house. Thank you.
Maybe I can ask
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you very much for the super interesting presentations. I'm curious how do you see, because this whole structures for sure accumulate certain lifestyles and certain societies. And I think it would be very romantic to say that these societies we have at the current time exist. So how do you see this kind of feedback loop between this research or project of Turfiction and can it become sort of social sort of feedback amplifier to change society? I assume you have the idea that it should sort of start certain processes, because I assume that the lifestyles, the infrastructures, as was mentioned, which didn't exist, and so certain relationships between private and public were implemented in this type of agglomerations. In our days, I have never been to Iceland, but we see a bit. There are infrastructures for public education, for certain government apparatus and so on. So how do you see that relationship? Because now there was a lot of discussion from a material perspective.
It's a very intriguing and also, of course, a difficult question, because because of this sort of vast difference. But then again, like I was saying before, maybe we have a special condition in Iceland since we are so few, and of course we have all these infrastructures. But you can imagine a city of 150,000 having I don't know how many TV stations, symphonic opera, all the governmental apparatus. I think we have 15 university level schools, or 12 or something. So in a sense, everyone has to be extremely socially interactive in a sense. So in many ways we have, and I once made a sort of poll around my students at the School of Architecture. Of course, this was not like a big enough group to make final decisions, but it turns out that in the generation of their parents and grandparents, but also in their generation, a majority of people had a space at home that was supposed to be able to accommodate someone outside the home. So not necessarily just that you would, get your nephew and they would sleep over at some time, but actually, your sister would come from the country or from or like we have in many cases, mixed families. So a lot of us have children from other relationships or marriages, and this has become quite influential because I would say more than half of the households of Reykjavik actually have to have extra rooms for the child that's there half of the time. So in a sense we have all these sort of social structures that remind us of the old ones. And then again, there are also very important questions that the turf house has that have to do with maybe more traditional roles of social sort of agency. For example, the host. In democratic settings, we have very much forgotten the role of the host. So everyone is always piling up, let's meet together, very democratic, blah, blah, blah. But then nothing works. Well, usually it is not working because there is no host to take responsibility for what's going on. So in a sense, that's also maybe one of the things that we are sort of trying to question in this very, let's say, basic form of living together, and has been able to inform us already. But we are also sort of at the beginning of our collaboration. We've been working together for some years, but all these questions on different levels, this sort of exploded view of what is of course something that will be ongoing and researched.
Well, it's not really a question, but I just had Well, first of all, comment, or rather compliment, or rather expression of the gratitude that you've been so amazingly generous and kind and receptive to the proposition of the swamp question, right, and the swamp challenge. So I really appreciate how elegantly you were kind of like interweaving your reflection, of some terms that were already circulating and constructing the foundations of the swamp school. Like futurity and symbiosis and so on. And only now, finally, I understood the importance of this image. Because we were grappling with this idea of the swamp intelligence, and we have also we collaborated with scientists in the Brain and Cognitive Science at MIT, constructing a small neuron network that will sort of like generate potential designs for the hybrid forms of architecture that merge kind of like symbiotic living forms beyond the human imagination, right? Assuming that we all the time thinking in some kind of patterns. So how to think as non-human species, right? It is philosophical proposition, but we wanted to extend that to the neural network, so the machine would start generating these images, and in a way that was sort of like our take on the Stafford Beer's cybernetic brain, like when he's proposed cybernetic brain, so this symbiotic brain, and finally sort of like you come into this sort of like embodiment of that sort of like it's a proposition of what could be this symbiotic brain. So yeah, just appreciate that a lot, and rather than maybe not maybe rather sort of like very practical question, I wanted to ask whether this sort of like modernist housing that eradicated and erased the Icelandic vernacular torf house, how that concrete houses, which we see now a lot, of course, in Iceland, and just sort of like as a parallel line, I have to say that these houses also primarily were sort of like started to be seeded, but as the part of, as you mentioned, also Marshall Plan, it was mentioned, Marshall Plan, but also part of this military-industrial complex, right? So sort of like military-industrial complex with the capitalism, sort of like tries to promote certain forms of life, and what for me, I'm very curious whether within this condition, what was described as the extreme condition, called wet and windy, whether you really have evidence of the mold that sort of like takes over, right? Is it so that the swamps coming back and striking back against these concrete houses? I'm just curious, like.
Definitely. No, definitely, because in these conditions, like you were pointing out, on one hand we have, of course, the electricity and the geothermal sort of heat that allows us to heat up the houses and actually up to the level that we all have our windows open and can ventilate quite a lot. But on the other hand, I mean, these conditions are quite inviting, and maybe Hjörtur or Pauline can elaborate on that. So, and also in the sense, because I mean, most of the houses in Iceland are cast on site. So these are not sort of building units that are brought up together. And we haven't had that much experience, I mean, now less than a century, of using the material of concrete. I mean, it's partially Icelandic, of course, and we have had problems with all kinds of what do you call it, alkali damages and things like that, that also invite these secondary, for us in the modern house, secondary sort of generation of flora and fauna within the houses. So people are trying desperately to sort of block that out by making all kinds of experiment, isolating on the inside, isolating on the outside, But being, and also, like I said before, being on the tundra belt constantly freezing and thawing also invites a certain sort of richness for these species. But yes, I don't know whether it answers your question. But another point that I also wanted to point out, since you were discussing the sort of conditions of the modernist times, like Hannes was pointing out, not only did the house change, but this sort of drying up of the swamps, and also by that reorganizing the whole territory, the whole sort of being of the agricultural, let's say profession, not the profession, but you know the how we sort of treated the earth and thought about the earth. So, and instead of measuring distances by how long it would take to be on a horseback, it would be the tractor instead, or the car, and that sort of has huge impact on how we at which scale, if you will, we approach the earth and the landscape.